Joyce Maynard's memoir, At Home in the World, is the story of a girl who loved and lived with J.D. Salinger and the woman she became. It is a misleading description that gives the wrong impression, namely the impression that this volume is simply a crass attempt to cash in on our celebrity, obsessed culture's appetite for gossip. Although many readers will doubtless find the Salinger chapters the most compelling and unsettling part of this book, At Home in the World, is not a sleazy tell-all memoir about the author's affair with a famous and famously reclusive man. It's actually an earnest, if at times self-serving, autobiography that in the course of tracing the author's coming of age delineates her first serious love affair, one that happened to be with the author of Catcher in the Rye. At Home is too sopilistic, too beholden to the professional tenets of the therapeutic movement to be a first-rate memoir, but it is often bears an uncomfortable resemblance to an analysis session. It also a far cry from Here but Not There, Lillian Ross's self-aggrandizing account of her affair with the New York editor William Shawn. Certainly, Mrs. Maynard is no newcomer to the craft of autobiography. She first came to national attention in 1972 with an essay titled An 18-Year-Old Looks Back on Life, published in the New York Times magazine, and has since continued to chronicle her own life through columns, essays, books, and the internet. Compared with those earlier forays into autobiography, At Home demonstrates a marked leap forward in maturity and emotional candor. The sanctimonious world weariness affected in An 18-Year-Old, in which Mrs. Maynard presumes to speak for her generation, has been replaced by a more direct, uninflective voice, just as the cloying tone of many of her essays has given way to a more unsparing brand of self-scrutiny. In fact, Mrs. Maynard writes in this volume with a sort of double vision, recreating the girl and young woman she was, while at the time looking at that younger self through the retrospective lens of middle age. She points out that she once used her storytelling skills to create a family mythology more comfortable than the real one she couldn't bear to acknowledge, and that the young spokesperson persona she frequently adopted was just that, a persona that enabled her to pretend to be the all-American girl, the Miss Teenage America of print that she knew she wasn't. Throughout her youth, Mrs. Maynard now tells us she felt like a misfit, cut off from her classmates in the small town of Durham, New Hampshire. This was in large part a consequence of her analogous childhood as the young daughter of an overbearing mother and an alcoholic father who shared extravagant dreams for her future. While Mrs. Maynard recalls that her mother's lavished her Martha Stewart skills on the family, knitting a sweater for one of Joy's stuffed animals with toothpicks, she also subjected her daughter to sexual suggestive cuddling. Her father, too, had a Jekyll and Hyde-like personality. A daytime father, a professor at the University of New Hampshire, was trim, handsome, fastidious, funny, brilliant, and courtly. Nighttime daddy, the drinker, was rageful and depressed, unshaven, unkempt, red-eye, and ranting. Pushed to achieve the kind of worldly success that had eluded her parents, the young Joyce became a willful, ambitious child, desperate to win their approval. At 9 or 10, she wrote the president of CBS suggesting she might play the daughter on the Danny Thomas Show. At 15, she wrote the Children's Television Workshop, suggesting it include a teenage character to be played by herself on Sesame Street. Perhaps it is this precocity, reminiscent of qualities possessed by the Glass children, that first attracted the attention of J.D. Salinger. After reading her 1972 article in the Times Magazine and seeing her photo, he writes with a fan letter she recalls that the two start corresponding. Salinger telling her they're soulmates and rhapsodizing about her writing, while Mrs. Maynard natters on, tailoring her language to suit him about her life as a freshman at Yale. Eventually, the letters give way to phone calls and the phone calls to visits. The second time Mrs. Maynard visits Salinger's New Hampshire home, she says they end up in his bedroom. Within months, she has dropped out of Yale and moved in with him. Her parents' reaction is decidedly odd. They not only shrug off the 35-year-old difference between their daughter and her 53-year-old companion, but actually give the relationship the seal of their approval. As depicted by Mrs. Maynard, Salinger emerges as an eccentric curmudgeon dedicated to the practice of homeopathic medicine and so possessed with the strictures of his diet, mainly raw fruits, vegetables, and nuts, that he forces himself to throw up whenever he eats something bad. Although he is an occasional playful, even childish, she says he is more often bitter, judgmental, and suspicious. He dismisses doctors, Mrs. Maynard writes, as a bunch of cardigan wearers who couldn't cut it on the PGA tours, declares a lot of jazz is outright fraud, and rails against political leaders, therapists, feminists, the publishing establishment, and John Updike. It's not long before his outlook is passed on to Mrs. Maynard, reinforcing her own alienation. In one way or another, Mrs. Maynard writes, what Jerry is telling me all that spring and summer returns to one relentless refrain. You are alone in the world. Nobody else is like you. No one will understand you. When she expresses excitement over being interviewed on the subject of the 60s, she recalls, he tells her, these people have corrupted you. They've made you worldly, greedy, hungry person. The relationship ends less than a year after it started. Mrs. Maynard writes, when Salinger takes her on a trip to Daytona Beach, Florida, with his two children, then abruptly tells her to go home and remove her things from his house. When she confronts him some 20 years later, after her own marriage and divorce and the birth of 3 children, she reports that he has little to say. I didn't exploit you, she recalls him as saying, I don't even know you.